On the last day of Camelot, the sky didn't just darken. It collapsed. Thick clouds strangled the sun before dawn even touched the castle towers. The birds had gone silent. The wind refused to move, and the air tasted like something was dying. Ewan felt it before he saw it. He'd carried swords, cleaned blood, stood in line behind knights who never remembered his name. But even he knew something terrible had already begun. Camelot, the heart of Albion, the city of banners and oaths, was quiet, not the quiet of peace, but the kind that creeps in when everyone's holding their breath, the kind of silence that waits for the scream. Ewan crossed the great hall. The throne room, once full of echoing footsteps and golden banners, now stood still. The tapestries barely moved. The air was thick. Then he saw it. Merlin's staff. It lay alone in the center of the chamber, as if it had been placed, not dropped. No scorch marks, no broken stone, just the staff, and nothing else. No one knew how long it had been there. No guards had seen him leave. No footsteps marked the path. Just that staff, and the sense that something enormous had exited the room without ever opening a door. Merlin was gone. Gone, not like a man who runs. Gone like a ghost evaporating in sunlight. And Ewan was the first to notice, the first to feel the hair on the back of his neck rise. The great wizard, the king's most trusted shadow, the last keeper of the old magic, had vanished, and in his absence, something ancient and heavy seemed to settle over the stones, as if the castle itself knew what was coming. Ewan searched the halls like a man chasing a shadow he wasn't sure he'd seen. He didn't shout Merlin's name, not really. He just whispered it into corners, into stairwells, into rooms that seemed colder than they should have been. He passed guards who looked away, scribes who kept writing even though their hands were trembling. No one wanted to ask the question they all felt gnawing at their thoughts. Where was he? Ewan followed the trail no one else dared to follow. A set of faint scorch marks on the stone, curved in a spiral. A door left cracked open in the south wing, the door to the crypts. The royal crypts were not for the living. They breathed with their own silence. They swallowed sound and made stone feel like skin. He stood at the top of the staircase, holding a torch that felt too small. The light barely touched the first step. The air reeked, not of rot, but of something metallic, like blood, like a storm that never came. Ewan didn't know what pulled him forward. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe, and this he'd never admit, he already knew Merlin wasn't coming back, and part of him wanted proof. The deeper he walked, the stranger the crypt felt. The walls began to hum, not loudly, more like a pulse, something deep and old. And then silence again. He reached the final chamber. Nothing. No footprints. No flicker of a robe. Just cold stone. And the feeling that someone had stood there moments ago, holding back a force too large to name. He should have turned back. Instead, he stepped further into the dark, chasing a wizard who had already crossed a line no man was meant to touch. The crypts weren't endless, but they felt that way. The torch in Ewan's hand flickered not from wind, but from the weight of what surrounded him. The deeper he walked, the more the silence felt alive. Dust hung in the air like frozen breath. Moss climbed the walls like veins. Every step echoed back slower than it should, as if the stones themselves were reluctant to pass the sound along. And then the chamber, a place even the oldest knights never spoke of. He stepped inside, expecting emptiness. But the torchlight caught someone, a figure, slumped, still, not dead, but motionless, like a dream that refused to wake. She was old, or maybe not. Her face was hidden by strands of hair, tangled and long. Chains, rusted and ancient, bound her wrists to a ring in the floor. The shackles were covered in symbols, none he recognized, none he wanted to, but what struck him most wasn't the chains. It was the air. It had changed, thicker now, like the moment before thunder. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak, but somehow he knew. She was the last one who had seen Merlin, and whatever she had seen had shattered her. He looked around. No sign of a struggle, no broken stone, just the soft pulse of something ancient, magic that hadn't left, only settled, like smoke. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. Her presence was a message in itself. He felt it. The veil between this world and the next wasn't just thin here. It had already been torn. And Merlin had walked through it. Asterisk, they called it the shattering. Not a spell, not a curse. A severing, final, irreversible. A ritual so old its name was buried under 1,000 layers of silence. Asterisk. And Merlin had done it. Willingly. Deliberately. Ewan didn't witness it, not with his eyes. But he felt it. In that chamber. In the cracks of the stone. In the lingering hum that refused to die. Asterisk, he imagined it because he couldn't help it. A circle of runes, carved into the floor by hands older than kingdoms. Blood not spilled but given. Symbols that pulsed once, then went still forever. Merlin standing at the center, his staff raised like a blade between worlds. His robes heavy with rain that hadn't fallen. His eyes not looking up, but inward. Asterisk. This wasn't escape. It wasn't exile. It was surrender, not to death, but to something more vast. Something only he had seen coming. Camelot was rotting from the inside. The betrayal, the silence, the pride. They had woven themselves into the stone. The kingdom no longer needed a wizard. It needed a sacrifice. He didn't burn the city. He didn't save it either. Asterisk, he stepped away. Away from the throne. Away from the king. Away from everything he had once sworn to protect. Asterisk. And in that stepping, the veil opened. Not a door. Not a portal. But a wound, one stitched shut with silence, blood, and magic too old to name. Asterisk. Ewan could still feel it pulsing beneath the floor, like a second heartbeat under the world. Merlin wasn't dead. He was simply elsewhere, beyond. The morning after Merlin vanished, the sky changed color. Not to black, not to red, but to something in between, a bruised gray that never brightened. The castle groaned. The stones sweated. Servants whispered of doors slamming in rooms no one entered. Horses refused to cross the inner gate. Fires wouldn't stay lit. Something fundamental had unraveled. By noon, the knights began to argue. Not over war, not over strategy, but over nothing. They fought over water, over words, over glances. By dusk, 3 were dead. Ewan watched it all, and he understood. This wasn't grief. It was infection. The queen vanished 2 days later. Not kidnapped, not taken, just gone. Her chambers left untouched. Her crown still resting on silk. As if she'd simply stepped out of the world and closed the curtain behind her. And the king, Arthur, once lion-hearted, locked himself in the chapel. He knelt before a god he no longer believed in, praying to silence. And silence answered. There was no invasion, no siege, no fire from above. Camelot died the way kingdoms truly die, from within. Not in a scream, in a slow, unrelenting exhale. And in the center of it all was absence. The missing wizard, the hollow where his presence used to be. Merlin's disappearance wasn't a vanishing. It was a removal of a cornerstone, and the tower, so proud and tall, cracked, then fell. Ewan returned to the crypt, not because he expected answers, but because there was nowhere else to go. The castle had become a husk, the corridors silent, the faces hollowed, and the world above no longer felt real. The chamber was colder now. The air moved differently, not with wind, but with weight. The woman was gone, the chains broken, no trail, no trace, just a new object in her place. Something smooth, faintly glowing. It was a mirror, but not of glass. It shimmered like oil on water, but held no reflection. Only movement, memory. He leaned in, not too close, and the surface rippled. Camelot appeared, but not the one he knew. This one was already falling. The towers leaned, not from battle, but from rot. The gardens withered, despite the sun. Knights argued in empty halls. The throne sat occupied, but by no one. And in the center of it all stood Merlin. Motionless, silent, watching. He didn't try to stop the decay. He didn't fight the fire. He just stood, like a man who had already given everything, and realized it wasn't enough. Then the image trembled. The sky split, and Merlin vanished, not in a flash, in a fold like parchment creased and taken from view. The mirror went still. The chamber darkened. The staff in Ewan's hand felt heavier. He had seen a death, not of a man, but of hope, and in its place only questions. There was no moment of clarity, no sudden understanding, just a weight that settled into Ewan's bones. He stood in the crypt long after the mirror dimmed, long after the torch died, and in that dark, a truth whispered, not in words, but in stillness. Merlin didn't flee. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He let go. He had stood at the heart of Camelot long enough to feel the sickness growing beneath its gold, the slow erosion of what made the kingdom noble, the rot that ceremony could no longer cover. He had warned them, not once, not twice, over years, in riddles, in fire, in silence. And when they refused to see, he stopped trying. He knew what was coming. He knew what pride and blindness would cost. And so he chose absence, because presence, his presence, only delayed the inevitable. If he stayed, they would lean on him again, beg him to fix the cracks while they kept making them. If he left, maybe they'd be forced to look at what they had become. It wasn't abandonment, it was refusal. Refusal to carry a kingdom that no longer cared to stand on its own. Ewan understood now, and with that understanding came grief. Not for Merlin, not even for Camelot, but for what could have been had they listened. The staff felt different in his hands now, not like a relic, like a wound, one that would never quite close. Ewan never spoke of what he saw, not to the new king, not to the scribes, not even to the boy who would one day wear the crown and ask quietly about the man they used to call wizard. There were no words, only memory, and the staff still whole, still heavy. Years passed. Camelot changed. Walls were rebuilt. Flags were replaced. Faces came and went. But beneath it all, the crack remained. A quiet fracture beneath the stone, invisible to those who didn't know where to feel for it. And every year, on the day the sky first dimmed, Ewan returned to the crypt, not as a squire, not as a knight, just as the last one who remembered. The chamber was always silent, the mirror long cold, the chains rusted to dust. And yet he waited. He never called out, never begged, never prayed, just stood as still as Merlin had been, watching the dark, listening for something he could never describe. Some years nothing happened. Other years, the air shifted, slightly, a whisper with no sound, a breath where there should be none, a feeling like fingers brushing across the veil. He never turned around, never reached out, because part of him believed, truly believed, that if Merlin ever returned, it wouldn't be to fix the kingdom. It would be for something else entirely. And when that day came, someone would need to be there to witness it.